They said the moon goddess blessed every heart with a moment to be seen, but for Claire Whitmore, that moment had never come. The first notes of the orchestra drifted beneath the crystal chandeliers of Silvercrest Palace, soft and elegant as moonlight spilling across a frozen lake, while hundreds of guests filled the grand ballroom in gowns that shimmered like starlight and tailored jackets adorned with silver embroidery, each family eager to celebrate the annual Moon Festival, the one night every unmated wolf dreamed could change an ordinary life forever. Laughter floated through the air, glasses chimed together, polished marble reflected the glow of countless candles, and every eye searched for beauty, power, or opportunity. Claire stood quietly near one of the towering white columns at the edge of the ballroom, almost blending into its pale stone. Her light blue dress had been carefully mended by her own hands so many times that the stitches had become part of its design. It fit well enough, though nothing about it could compete with the gowns surrounding her. She lowered her gaze as another young alpha crossed the floor with confident steps before offering his hand to one of the celebrated daughters of a noble pack. Cheers rose around them as the music swelled. Claire smiled politely, even though no one was looking at her. She had practiced that smile for years, gentle enough to hide disappointment, warm enough to keep people from asking questions she no longer wished to answer. Across the ballroom, another couple joined the dance, then another, until graceful figures spun beneath silver banners embroidered with the royal crest of the Northern Kingdom. Servants moved quietly between guests carrying polished trays filled with sparkling cider and delicate desserts, while musicians guided the rhythm with perfect precision. Somewhere nearby, a group of young women whispered behind jeweled fans before one of them glanced toward Claire and quickly looked away with an awkward laugh. She pretended not to notice. It was easier that way. Ever since the rejection ceremony nearly 3 years earlier, her name had become little more than a quiet warning passed from one family to another. Rejected Omega, broken destiny, unwanted match. No one ever said those words loudly anymore. They no longer needed to. Silence had become far more effective. Claire folded her hands in front of her and watched another song begin. One by one, every eligible woman stepped onto the polished dance floor with a partner. Even girls who had arrived trembling with nervous excitement were smiling now as they turned beneath the golden lights. The empty space beside Claire somehow felt larger with every passing minute. She counted the dances without meaning to. 1, then 2, then 3. The orchestra never paused long enough for hope to settle before another invitation echoed through the room. A gentleman bowed. Another hand reached forward. Another joyful laugh answered. Yet no footsteps ever approached the quiet corner where Claire waited. She did not blame them anymore. Pity hurt less than expectation. Still, somewhere deep beneath the careful calm she wore like another layer of fabric, a small voice continued asking the same impossible question. What if tonight was different? She almost laughed at herself for thinking it. The answer had already been written across every passing glance and every deliberate avoidance. Even the palace attendants seemed uncertain whether to greet her as a guest or simply walk around her as though she belonged to the walls themselves. Claire gently smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her skirt and lifted her chin toward the glittering ballroom once more, determined that no one would see the ache hidden behind her quiet eyes. Because if the world insisted she was invisible, then she would disappear with grace. The fourth song began with a graceful sweep of violins, its melody floating through the ballroom like a promise that belonged to everyone except Claire Whitmore. Around her, elegant couples crossed the polished marble in perfect rhythm, their laughter blending with the music until it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Every graceful turn seemed to remind her that she alone remained still. She watched as fathers proudly introduced daughters to respected alphas, as friends exchanged delighted smiles after receiving invitations, and as hopeful conversations blossomed into dances beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. It was the kind of evening little girls imagined long before they were old enough to attend the Moon Festival. Claire had imagined it too, once. She remembered being 16, secretly practicing waltz steps in the tiny kitchen of her childhood home while her mother laughed softly and counted the rhythm. Back then, the future had seemed as bright as the moonlit sky outside their window. Before rejection became part of her identity, she had believed destiny would arrive with kindness. A burst of cheerful applause pulled her back to the present as another couple completed their dance. The young woman accepted compliments with flushed cheeks while her partner bowed with practiced confidence. Nearby, two noble women lowered their voices just enough to sound discreet, though Claire heard every word. "Perhaps she is waiting for a miracle." The other answered with a quiet smile. "Miracles usually know where they are welcome." Their laughter was gentle rather than cruel, yet somehow that made it hurt even more. Claire simply looked toward the musicians as if the conversation had belonged to someone else. She refused to let bitterness become the loudest voice inside her heart. Instead, she focused on the familiar comfort of observing the room. An elderly couple moved carefully through the slower melody, smiling at each other with the ease of decades shared together. A little boy in a tiny formal jacket tried to imitate the dancers until his mother scooped him into her arms, both of them laughing. A servant hurried to replace an empty tray before anyone noticed it was gone. Life continued beautifully all around her, untouched by the quiet loneliness standing beside the marble column. Claire reminded herself that happiness was not something to resent simply because it had not found her yet. She straightened her shoulders and offered a warm smile to a passing server, who looked startled before returning it with grateful relief. Even unnoticed kindness could make someone else's evening lighter. Another melody began, softer than the last, and once again, gentlemen crossed the ballroom with confidence, extending open hands toward waiting partners. Claire felt the familiar flutter of impossible hope rise before gently fading away as each invitation found another smiling face. She drew a slow breath and folded her hands together, refusing to let disappointment show. If this night remembered everyone except her, then she would meet its silence with dignity. Yet somewhere beyond the towering doors of the royal hall, unseen footsteps were drawing closer with quiet purpose. And without realizing it, the entire kingdom was only moments away from witnessing a dance no one would ever forget. Claire Whitmore waited until the fourth dance had carried nearly every guest back onto the ballroom floor before quietly slipping away from the marble column that had become her silent refuge. She moved through the edge of the grand hall with such gentle grace that few people noticed her leaving. And those who did quickly returned their attention to brighter conversations and happier faces. The music softened behind her as she entered a wide corridor lined with tall, arched windows. Beyond the glass, the palace gardens glowed beneath a brilliant full moon, silver light spilling across trimmed hedges, quiet fountains, and winding stone paths. The cool evening air drifting through an open terrace door carried the scent of blooming jasmine, offering a peaceful contrast to the excitement inside. Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment and drew a slow breath, allowing the calm to settle the ache she had carefully hidden all evening. She reminded herself that disappointment did not have to become despair. Sometimes all a lonely heart needed was a few quiet minutes beneath the same moon that watched over everyone without choosing favorites. A sudden clatter interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find an elderly palace servant kneeling beside an overturned basket, dozens of polished silver napkin rings scattered across the stone floor. The older woman hurried to gather them with trembling hands, clearly anxious about the growing mess. Without hesitation, Claire lowered herself beside her. "Please do not worry," she said with a warm smile. "We can finish before anyone notices." Together they collected each piece with patient care. The servant looked at Claire with grateful eyes that shimmered in the moonlight. "Thank you, miss. Most guests would have walked straight past me." Claire simply smiled. "My mother always said that kindness should never depend on who is watching." The woman gently squeezed Claire's hand before continuing toward the ballroom, her steps noticeably lighter than before. Claire remained in the corridor only a moment longer before hearing another small voice nearby. A little girl wearing a pale lavender dress stood near one of the windows, tears threatening to spill from her bright green eyes as she searched the floor beneath a bench. "Did you lose something?" Claire asked softly. The child nodded. "My bracelet. My grandmother gave it to me, and I cannot find it anywhere." Claire knelt once again, carefully searching beneath the carved wooden bench until a tiny silver bracelet caught the moonlight beneath the hem of a curtain. She lifted it with a relieved smile and fastened it carefully around the little girl's wrist. The child beamed as though Claire had returned something far greater than jewelry. "Thank you," she whispered before running happily back toward the celebration. Claire watched her disappear with genuine joy warming her heart. No applause followed. No noble guests witnessed the moment. No one praised the quiet Omega whose own evening had been filled with silent disappointment. Yet somehow, helping others eased the weight she carried. As she turned to return to the ballroom, she noticed a dark formal cloak resting neatly across a nearby chair. It must have slipped from the shoulders of one of the palace attendants rushing between duties. She carefully folded it, brushed away a few tiny petals carried in by the evening breeze, and placed it where it would be easily found. Hidden behind the shadow of a stone archway, unseen by Claire or anyone else in the corridor, a tall figure stood perfectly still. Calm silver eyes had witnessed every quiet act of compassion from beginning to end. He said nothing. He did not step forward. But for the first time that evening, someone had looked beyond the glitter of gowns and titles and noticed the woman whose heart remained gentle even when her own had every reason to break. Claire Whitmore stepped back into the grand ballroom just as the orchestra reached the final notes of another elegant waltz. For a brief moment, she wondered if anyone had noticed she was gone, but the answer surrounded her before the thought could fully form. The celebration flowed forward without interruption. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, conversations rose and fell like gentle waves, and couples drifted across the marble floor with effortless grace. Her quiet absence had changed nothing. She returned to the same place near the towering white column, smoothing the folds of her carefully mended blue dress before folding her hands once more. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, a bell rang a single clear note that echoed across the kingdom. Almost immediately, every musician lowered their instruments. Every servant straightened. Every conversation dissolved into silence. The unexpected stillness spread through the ballroom with remarkable speed, until the only sound remaining was the distant crackle of candles burning along the walls. Claire lifted her eyes toward the massive golden doors at the far end of the hall. They began to open slowly. Moonlight streamed through the widening entrance before rows of royal guards stepped inside with measured precision, their silver cloaks moving in perfect unison. No voice announced the arrival. None was necessary. Every guest already knew. Noble families bowed their heads with practiced respect. Distinguished alphas stood straighter than before. Even the youngest children instinctively fell silent beneath the overwhelming sense of dignity filling the room. Then, he appeared. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood crossed the threshold with calm, unhurried confidence, wearing a tailored black formal coat embroidered with subtle silver thread that reflected the moonlight rather than the candles. His dark hair rested neatly against his collar, and his clear silver eyes moved quietly across the grand hall without the slightest trace of arrogance. There was no need for dramatic gestures. His presence alone transformed the atmosphere. Stories about him had traveled across every territory in the Northern Kingdom. They spoke of a ruler whose judgment was fair, whose words carried the weight of law, and whose composure never faltered regardless of triumph or hardship. Yet among all the stories whispered during countless moon festivals, one detail had become almost legendary. Since ascending the throne 8 years earlier, Adrian Blackwood had never accepted a ceremonial dance. Every invitation from noble daughters, respected leaders, and foreign princesses had been declined with the same quiet courtesy. Many believed he simply had no interest in such traditions. Others insisted he was waiting for something only destiny could reveal. Claire had never given much thought to those rumors. Kings lived in a world impossibly distant from hers. Their paths were never meant to cross. As Adrian acknowledged greetings from respected elders, his gaze remained thoughtful rather than distracted. He noticed polished marble, glowing chandeliers, proud families, elegant gowns, and smiling faces, yet his expression barely changed. It was almost as though he searched for something hidden beneath the beauty surrounding him. His silver eyes passed over one celebrated noblewoman after another without lingering. The hopeful excitement slowly faded from many expectant smiles as he continued walking deeper into the ballroom. Claire lowered her gaze again, believing herself safely beyond notice. She had no reason to think otherwise. A forgotten Omega standing quietly beside a marble column did not belong in the thoughts of a king. Yet, from the opposite side of the ballroom, Adrian's steady footsteps never slowed. And his calm silver eyes had already found the only person in the room whose kindness had shone brightest where no applause had followed. The silence lingered for another heartbeat after Alpha King Adrian Blackwood entered the ballroom, as though even the air itself hesitated to move in his presence. Then, with a subtle gesture from the royal conductor, the orchestra began a slow, elegant melody unlike any played earlier that evening. It was the traditional piece reserved for the king's choice, the dance no one expected to witness because year after year, the music had always faded unfinished. A quiet wave of anticipation swept through the hall. Noble daughters instinctively straightened their shoulders. Mothers exchanged hopeful glances. Distinguished alphas stepped aside, leaving the center of the ballroom clear. Every eye followed Adrian as he descended the wide marble staircase leading toward the dance floor. His pace was measured, calm, and impossible to predict. The polished floor reflected the silver embroidery along the edge of his formal coat as he passed the first group of guests. A young noblewoman offered a graceful curtsy accompanied by a hopeful smile. Adrian acknowledged her with a respectful nod but continued walking without slowing. Another family subtly positioned their daughter closer to his path, confident that her beauty and celebrated lineage would surely draw his attention. Once again, he offered only polite courtesy before moving forward. Murmurs began spreading quietly through the ballroom. No one could determine where he intended to stop. Claire Whitmore remained near the white column, watching from a distance with no expectation beyond simple admiration. Kings belonged at the center of history. She had long accepted that people like her existed only at its edges. She lowered her gaze before anyone could mistake her curiosity for hope. The orchestra carried the melody forward while Adrian continued across the ballroom, passing every woman whose name had been whispered as a possible future queen. Confusion slowly replaced confidence among the assembled nobles. One by one, hopeful smiles softened into puzzled expressions. His destination remained a mystery. Claire noticed the movement only from the corner of her eye. The steady rhythm of polished shoes against marble sounded closer than before. She assumed the king was simply crossing toward another gathering of honored guests behind her, so she shifted slightly to make room without lifting her head. The footsteps did not continue past. They stopped. She frowned almost imperceptibly, uncertain why the silence around her suddenly felt different. Conversations had disappeared. Even the orchestra seemed strangely distant beneath the pounding of her own heartbeat. Slowly, almost afraid to discover she had misunderstood, Claire raised her eyes. Adrian stood directly before her. Barely 3 feet separated them. His expression remained calm, composed, and quietly thoughtful, free from pity or surprise. He looked at her exactly as he had looked at respected leaders throughout the evening, with complete attention and genuine respect. Claire instinctively glanced behind herself, certain someone more important must be standing nearby. There was no one. She looked to either side. Only the marble column and open space greeted her. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face as realization settled over her. The king had walked past every celebrated beauty, every powerful family, every carefully arranged introduction, and had stopped before the one woman everyone else had forgotten. Around the ballroom, astonished whispers spread faster than the music itself. Noble guests exchanged bewildered glances while even seasoned palace attendants struggled to hide their surprise. No one understood what they were witnessing. Claire could barely understand it herself. Her hands tightened gently around the fabric of her dress as she searched Adrian's silver eyes for some sign that a mistake had been made. Instead, she found only quiet certainty, as though the longest walk in the kingdom had ended exactly where it had always been meant to end. For what felt like an endless moment, neither of them moved. Claire Whitmore could hear the quiet melody filling the ballroom, yet every other sound seemed to disappear beneath the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. She searched Adrian Blackwood's face for uncertainty, for hesitation, for any sign that he had mistaken her for someone else. Instead, his silver eyes remained calm, warm, and unwavering, holding the same quiet respect they had carried from the instant he stopped before her. It was not the look of a king fulfilling a ceremony. It was the look of a man who had already made his choice. Then, with graceful confidence, Adrian extended his hand toward her. The gesture was simple, no dramatic flourish, no royal announcement, just an open hand offered with complete sincerity. His deep voice carried clearly through the silent ballroom. "Miss Claire Whitmore, would you honor me with this dance?" The words settled over the hall like moonlight across still water. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. Claire stared at the offered hand, unable to convince herself the moment was real. She had imagined countless futures during lonely nights, but never one where the king himself would speak her name with such kindness. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice trembling almost imperceptibly. "I believe you may have mistaken me for someone else." A faint smile touched Adrian's expression, gentle enough that only Claire could truly see it. "I rarely make that mistake," he replied. "I know exactly who you are." Those few words reached places inside her heart that years of loneliness had carefully locked away. No one around them understood why tears suddenly gathered in Claire's eyes. But they were not tears of sadness. They came from something she had nearly forgotten could exist: relief. For the first time since her rejection, someone had looked directly at her instead of through her. Someone had spoken her name without attaching shame to it. Someone had seen the person she had struggled so hard to remain, despite every disappointment. Her fingers hesitated only a moment longer before slowly reaching toward his. They were cool from nervousness, while Adrian's hand felt steady and reassuring as he gently closed his fingers around hers with perfect courtesy. There was no possessiveness, only quiet encouragement, allowing her every chance to step back if she wished. She did not. Around them, astonished whispers swept across the ballroom. Noble guests exchanged bewildered glances while mothers quietly lowered the hopeful smiles they had worn only moments before. Young alphas stared in disbelief, unable to understand why the ruler of the Northern Kingdom had ignored every celebrated beauty to invite the forgotten Omega standing beside a marble column. Claire barely noticed any of them. As Adrian led her toward the center of the ballroom, she found herself matching his measured pace, one careful step at a time. Her breathing gradually steadied. The fear that had followed her throughout the evening slowly gave way to cautious trust. The polished marble reflected their approaching figures beneath the glow of countless chandeliers, and the orchestra gently expanded into the full waltz reserved for the king's dance. Every pair of eyes followed them, yet Adrian never looked toward the crowd. His attention remained on Claire alone, making the enormous ballroom somehow feel unexpectedly small. Standing at the center beneath silver banners and crystal light, Claire realized something far more extraordinary than being chosen for a dance had already happened. Before Adrian ever offered his hand, he had given her something she believed she had lost forever. He had reminded her that she was worthy of being seen. The first measure of the royal waltz echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers as Adrian Blackwood gently placed one hand in position and waited with quiet patience for Claire Whitmore to find the rhythm beside him. She hesitated only long enough to steady her breathing before taking her first graceful step. The polished marble reflected their movements like moonlight across still water, and although hundreds of eyes followed every turn they made, Adrian carried himself with the effortless composure of a man entirely unconcerned with the opinions surrounding him. Claire had expected embarrassment to overwhelm her the instant they reached the center of the ballroom. Instead, she found herself focusing only on the calm certainty in his silver eyes. Every movement he guided was respectful, allowing her confidence to return one careful step at a time. Around them, however, disbelief slowly transformed into restless whispers. Conversations that had once celebrated the festival now revolved around a single impossible question. Why her? A distinguished alpha from one of the oldest noble families finally stepped forward from the gathered crowd, his expression carefully controlled despite the obvious confusion in his voice. He offered Adrian a respectful bow before speaking. "Your Majesty, forgive my boldness, but many honored ladies have waited years for the privilege of this dance. Surely there has been some misunderstanding." The music continued without interruption, and Adrian never released Claire's hand. He simply guided her through another elegant turn before calmly answering, "There has been no misunderstanding." His voice remained measured and even, carrying across the silent ballroom without the slightest hint of anger. The nobleman hesitated before continuing. "She is not the choice many expected." Claire felt old wounds quietly reopening beneath those carefully chosen words. She lowered her eyes for only a heartbeat, fearing that perhaps this beautiful moment had been nothing more than a brief interruption before the world returned to reminding her exactly where she belonged. Adrian noticed the change immediately. He slowed their movement just enough for Claire to meet his gaze once more. There was no pity in his expression, only quiet reassurance. Then he looked toward the assembled guests. "Expectations are often built upon appearances," he said. "Character is revealed when no one believes they are being watched." A deep silence settled over the hall. Several palace attendants exchanged knowing glances as they remembered the elderly servant whose burden had been quietly lifted earlier that evening. Others recalled the smiling little girl happily wearing her recovered bracelet. Adrian continued with the same calm dignity. "I watched a woman help strangers without asking for recognition. I watched her offer kindness after receiving none herself. I watched her choose grace where many would have chosen bitterness. Those qualities deserve respect in every kingdom." No one answered. Even those who had whispered against Claire found themselves unable to challenge words spoken with such simple truth. Claire felt emotion rise quietly inside her once more, but this time she did not lower her head to hide it. For years, she had believed kindness disappeared unnoticed, fading into ordinary moments that no one remembered. Standing beside Adrian beneath the glow of silver light, she realized kindness had been seen after all. It simply had been witnessed by the one person whose judgment carried the greatest weight. As the orchestra carried them into another graceful turn, the restless whispers gave way to thoughtful silence, and for the first time that evening, the forgotten Omega was no longer standing alone against the judgment of the room. The ballroom remained wrapped in thoughtful silence as the royal waltz carried Adrian Blackwood and Claire Whitmore through another graceful turn beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. The earlier whispers had faded, replaced by quiet observation. Guests who had once looked past Claire now watched her with growing curiosity, as though they were seeing her for the very first time. She no longer felt the weight of countless judging eyes pressing against her shoulders. Instead, she focused on the steady rhythm of the music and the reassuring calm with which Adrian guided every step. There was no rush in his movements, no desire to impress the crowd. He danced as though this single moment deserved his complete attention. As they reached the center of the ballroom once more, moonlight streamed through the towering windows and spread across the polished marble floor. blending naturally with the warm candlelight until the entire hall seemed bathed in a gentle silver glow. Claire felt an unfamiliar warmth travel through her fingertips where Adrian still held her hand. It was not uncomfortable, nor frightening. It felt peaceful, like standing beneath the first rays of sunrise after a long winter. She looked down in quiet surprise. A delicate silver shimmer had begun to appear around the simple bracelet she had worn since childhood, reflecting the moonlight with unusual brilliance. Several nearby guests noticed it at the same moment. Soft murmurs rose once again, though this time they carried wonder instead of doubt. Adrian lowered his gaze toward the faint light without showing the slightest surprise. It was almost as though he had been waiting for this moment. The silver glow gradually spread, weaving around their joined hands before rising gently like tiny threads of moonlight dancing through the air. Elder members of the royal court exchanged astonished glances. One elderly woman quietly placed a hand over her heart as tears filled her eyes.
"The moon blessing," she whispered, barely above a breath. "I have not seen its light in decades."
The orchestra continued playing, though even the musicians seemed captivated by the quiet beauty unfolding before them. No brilliant flash interrupted the evening. No overwhelming spectacle demanded attention. Instead, the light remained soft and graceful, illuminating Claire with quiet dignity rather than overwhelming power. It was as if the moon goddess herself had chosen gentleness over grandeur. Claire looked toward Adrian, uncertainty filling her eyes.
"What is happening?"
she asked softly. Adrian smiled with the same calm warmth that had never left his expression. "Sometimes, destiny does not arrive to change who we are," he said. "Sometimes, it simply reveals the truth that has been waiting all along." Claire felt tears gathering once more, but she no longer tried to hide them. For years, she had believed rejection defined her future. She had accepted loneliness because she thought it was the life destiny had chosen for her. Yet standing beneath the moonlit ceiling of the royal ballroom, surrounded by people who had once overlooked her, she finally understood that another person's decision had never possessed the power to determine her worth. The gentle silver light slowly settled until it rested like a quiet blessing around them, before fading into the moonlight streaming through the windows. No one applauded. No one dared interrupt the sacred stillness filling the hall. In that peaceful silence, every heart present seemed to recognize the same simple truth. True honor had never belonged to the loudest voice, the richest family, or the brightest crown. It belonged to the soul that chose kindness when no reward seemed possible. And on that unforgettable evening, the entire kingdom had finally learned to see Claire Whitmore exactly as she had always been. As the final notes of the royal waltz floated gently through the grand ballroom, Adrian Blackwood slowed his steps until the music and their movements came to a perfect rest beneath the silver light pouring through the palace windows. For several quiet heartbeats, neither of them spoke. Claire Whitmore looked around the hall that had felt so impossibly large only an hour earlier. The same faces surrounded her, the same crystal chandeliers sparkled above, and the same marble floor reflected the glow of countless candles. Yet, everything had changed. She no longer stood hidden in the shadows of the celebration. She stood at its very heart. Adrian continued holding her hand with the same quiet respect he had shown from the beginning. Then, before anyone could guess what he intended, he stepped slightly forward and bowed his head with calm dignity. The simple gesture drew a collective breath from every guest in the ballroom. Kings accepted respect. They rarely demonstrated it so openly. Adrian lifted his eyes to meet Claire's once more. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Tonight, you reminded this kingdom that kindness does not become valuable because it is noticed. It is valuable because it is chosen." Claire felt emotion welling inside her once again, but this time she welcomed it with a peaceful smile. Years of quiet disappointment seemed to dissolve beneath those gentle words. She realized she no longer wished she had been someone else. Every hardship had shaped the compassion that Adrian had seen when no one else had cared to look. Around them, one guest after another slowly offered respectful applause. It began with the elderly palace servant Claire had helped in the corridor. Then came the little girl whose treasured bracelet had been returned. Soon, noble families, royal advisors, palace attendants, and musicians joined together until the ballroom echoed with warm applause that carried none of the forced excitement heard earlier that evening. This applause was different. It came from understanding rather than expectation. Several guests who had quietly judged Claire lowered their heads with sincere humility, recognizing that they had measured worth by reputation instead of character. Claire looked across the room without resentment. She did not need apologies to heal what kindness had already restored. Adrian smiled as the applause gradually faded into peaceful silence. "The Moon Festival celebrates destiny," he said. "But destiny begins with the choices we make long before anyone is watching." Claire nodded softly, understanding those words more deeply than anyone else present. She had not discovered her value that evening. She had simply stopped believing the voices that claimed she had none. Together they turned toward the towering palace windows where the full moon shone brilliantly above the kingdom, bathing the ballroom in quiet silver light. Beyond those walls, tomorrow would bring new conversations, new stories, and countless retellings of the unforgettable dance witnessed that night. Yet the memory that would remain strongest was not that a king had chosen a forgotten Omega. It was that he had recognized the quiet strength she had carried all along. And in doing so, he reminded an entire kingdom that the brightest hearts are often found where the world forgets to look.